Welcome to our webinar on risk assessment in care. This webinar is based on the course that we deliver to our professional care workers. We've taken out much of what we think is not or less relevant to you as informal carers, but we hope that there is more than enough included to be useful for you. We've removed sections on legislation around risk assessment. However, if you would like to know more about these aspects, please do contact us for more information. We do hope you enjoy the webinar. Settings. As informal carers, we're aiming to give you an overview of risk assessment and to provide you with some food for thought about risk in your own home or the home where the person you care for lives. We always like to have some learning outcomes to our webinars. Here are the ones for today. While we mention legislation, we will not be going into this in any great detail as it is of less relevance to you as informal carers. We will be looking at the common causes of accidents. We will look at the meaning of risk as related to health and safety. We will look at the steps necessary in any risk assessment. And finally, we'll look briefly at how we can support the risk assessment process. So, just a brief look at health and safety. As I said before, this course is adapted from the one that is taken by our professional care staff. For them, understanding health and safety is paramount. Here, for you as informal carers, we're going to touch on a number of areas. While some of this may feel irrelevant to you, if you employ a professional carer, it is useful to know the standards they are working to. Managing health and safety can essentially be broken down into three sets of duties. The moral duty to prevent accidents, whether this is to the person cared for, yourself as a carer, or any other people who might be involved in that care, whether they are paid or not. For professional care staff, there are also economic duties, as risk reduction is often important to the profitability of a business, but this is probably not relevant to you. Finally, there are legal duties. We have a legal obligation to do what we can to prevent accidents and reduce risk. I did say that we were not going to be looking at legislation, but I thought it would be useful to list the laws that professional care providers are operating under. As you can see, much of this is around health and safety at work. It is the duty of any employer to make an assessment of risk to both their employees and people they do not employ. Those of you who employ professional care staff will be familiar with the in-depth risk assessments that are done by the agency or staff before taking on any care duty, and that risk assessment forms part of an ongoing care as things such as activities or even the seasons change. So let's have a look at accidents. How do we define an accident? For our purposes, we define an accident as an unplanned event which may or may not result in injury or damage. Therefore, by definition, a near miss is an accident. Almost having an accident can alert us to risk factors that we may need to deal with. Accidents or near misses can take many forms, and I'm sure that you are familiar with many of them. As an example, slipping on an icy pathway to the front door could lead to a broken ankle or a nasty fall. Of course, it could also be a near miss if you regain your balance and carry on unharmed. The risk assessment is the process by which we can begin to reduce the likelihood of accidents or near misses. Now we're going to take a look at risk assessments. Risk assessments are a systematic, common sense approach to measuring risk. They should take into account a number of things. First, the hazard. Anything that has the potential to cause harm. Secondly, a hazardous event, when someone or something interacts with the hazard. Thirdly, likelihood, the chance that the hazardous event will occur. And fourthly, outcome, the outcome of the hazardous event. So, what is a hazard? In essence, a hazard can be defined as anything with the potential to cause harm. You could describe a hazard as an accident waiting to happen. A hazard could be something like unsafe equipment, broken or frayed kettle cord, for example. There could be unsafe conditions, trailing leads that you could trip over, loose rugs, slippery steps. Have a look around and see if there are any hazards that you can identify in your house. This morning, I slipped on a pair of shoes that had been placed on the stairs. Let's have a look at risk. Risk is the combination of the probability of the event occurring and the impact of that event. we can do a simple sum. Risk equals likelihood times outcome. When you understand that, you can then decide whether you have a high, medium or low risk. The risk assessment process outlined here is based on a health and safety executive publication. Not all of it is going to be relevant to you, but I think that it is useful to know the process and the steps involved. The steps are: firstly, look for hazards. Secondly, decide who might be harmed and how. Thirdly, evaluate the risks. Fourthly, record your findings. This might be the step not entirely necessary for you as an informal carer, but might still be useful. And fifthly, review and then revise it if necessary. And just a reminder of the benefits of risk assessments, even if you're doing them informally in your own home. They help prevent accidents, they help keep us safe, they help in communicating risk, they help us comply with the law, and they can save you money. Let's take a look at how we can complete or carry out a risk assessment. I do appreciate that as an informal carer, this is something that you would probably not do with a clipboard and a form, but the process can be a really useful one to reduce risk in your home or in the home of the person you care for. Stage 1 is looking for hazards. A good exercise in your own home is to spend 20 minutes looking at potential hazards. I did that this morning in my own home and was surprised by the number that I noted down. Shoes on the stairs, shoes in the middle of the kitchen floor, a tennis ball on the floor, a throw trailing on the floor, the lead for a computer stretched across a place people walk, and that was just a start. Here are some of the common hazards that have been identified by the Health and Safety Executive. Some or none might apply in your house, and some are clearly for staff. However, have a think about what hazards there might be. Some might be on that list. For instance, if you care for someone with dementia, occasionally you might be confronted with aggressive behaviour. You might be responsible for administering multiple medications. You might have some concerns about infection control. Whatever the hazards, the key thing here is to think about them and maybe make a list so you have them clear in your mind. Then we need to decide who might be at risk from harm. If there is a loose rug which your elderly father who is unsteady on their feet might trip over, then the answer is probably obvious. But it is also worth looking at who else might be at risk of harm. Visitors to the home, professional carers, grandchildren for example. And following on from the example of grandchildren, yes, it is important to look at people who might be at particular risk. Something that you do not regard as a risk for you might be a risk for someone else. Once you have identified the hazard and who might be at risk, you are then ready to evaluate that risk and, if need be, to decide what might need to be done. So, what are the things that we need to look at when evaluating risk? Firstly, how likely is it that each hazard will cause harm? Secondly, how serious could that harm be, or what could the impact be? Is the risk high, medium or low? Remember, it is important to use a common sense, realistic approach. This grid is a handy way of evaluating risk. On the left hand side is the probability and at the bottom is the impact. If you look at the bottom rectangle, you have both low probability and low impact. So when we are evaluating risk, something in this area which is low probability and low impact is clearly low risk. If we go to the opposite rectangle, you have something that is high probability and high impact. Therefore, it is clearly rated as high risk. As you can see, risk is all about thinking about both the impact and the probability. This is pertinent for paid staff, but not to you as an informal carer. That said, sometimes if you recognise a risk and feel that something needs to be done about it, taking a note may be very useful. As an informal carer, you don't have to record risk assessments, but given how busy many carers are, taking an informal note of things that you might want to do can be a real help. Here is an example of a risk assessment. Here you can see how the hazards have been identified, the people at potential risk identified, and what might be done to reduce the risk. You can never reduce risk to zero, but you can reduce the risk. If someone from a care agency or other organisation is carrying out a risk assessment in your home or the home of the person you care for, these are the things that they will be noting down. Significant hazards identified, the controls that are in place, the level of risk, the persons who are especially at risk, further controls that may be required to reduce that risk, and the date of assessment and the identification of the assessor. Risks change, and so should risk assessments. For this reason, professionals will always build in a review period so that the risk can be re-evaluated and recorded. For you as an informal carer, the important thing to note is that risks do change, and you should always be aware of that. Risks that are low in good weather may well become high in winter. People become less steady on their feet, and may be more prone to falls, and that will add to risk. So you need to keep change in mind and review any risks that you've identified on a regular basis. If things change considerably, then you might need to reassess more regularly. For instance, if the person you care for is coming out of hospital, what new risks might you need to consider? We've now come to the end of this webinar on risk assessment. As I said at the beginning, much of this is relevant to paid staff, but we think that it does have a relevance to you as an informal carer. We all want to reduce risk as much as we can to make sure that the person we care for and those around them are safe. We hope you found this webinar interesting. Thank you very much.